She said, "It's not the same thing. He's just my friend," when I objected to her weekend trip with her male bestie. I said, "I understand." Then I booked my own weekend trip. She found out how not the same it was when she saw who my travel companion was. I, 32M, never thought I'd be the type of guy to play games in a relationship, but sometimes life pushes you into corners you never expected to find yourself in. My wife had been talking about her weekend trip with her male best friend for weeks. She'd grown up with this guy, went to college with him, and according to her, they were practically siblings. When I expressed my discomfort about the two of them sharing a cabin in the mountains for 3 days, she laughed it off with that dismissive wave of her hand I'd grown to hate. She told me I was being ridiculous and insecure. She said it wasn't the same thing as if I went away with a female friend because their relationship was purely platonic. She insisted I was overthinking everything and that I should trust her judgment. She reminded me that she'd known him since childhood and that there had never been anything romantic between them. I listened to all of this while washing dishes, my hands growing tighter around the plates with each word. When she finished her speech about trust and friendship boundaries, I simply nodded and told her I understood. And I did understand. I understood exactly what kind of relationship we had. The next morning, while she was at work, I made a phone call to my ex-girlfriend. We'd remained friends after our breakup 5 years ago, before I met my wife. She'd moved across the country for work, but we still texted occasionally and exchanged holiday greetings. She was single, successful, and had always been easy to talk to. I explained the situation to her and asked if she'd be interested in a weekend getaway. Not anything romantic, I clarified, just two old friends catching up. She was intrigued by the drama and agreed it sounded like fun. She even offered to split the cost of a nice hotel in the city. My wife left for her mountain retreat on Friday afternoon with a kiss on my cheek and a reminder to water her plants. I waited exactly 2 hours before posting a photo on social media of my boarding pass, tagged at the airport with a simple caption, "Weekend adventure begins." I didn't mention who I was traveling with. I didn't need to yet. The flight was smooth, and catching up with my ex felt natural and comfortable. We talked about our careers, mutual friends, and yes, we talked about my marriage. She listened without judgment as I explained how isolated I'd been feeling lately, how my concerns were consistently dismissed, and how I was tired of being made to feel like the unreasonable one. We checked into a beautiful hotel downtown, got separate rooms as planned, and spent the evening exploring the city. I posted a few photos of the skyline, the restaurant we went to, and a shot of 2 wine glasses at dinner. Still no tag of my companion, but anyone looking closely could see there were clearly 2 people in the reflection of the restaurant window. Saturday morning brought 17 missed calls from my wife. When I finally answered, she was practically screaming. She wanted to know where I was, who I was with, and why I was posting cryptic photos online. I calmly told her I was having a weekend getaway with an old friend, just like she was. I reminded her that it wasn't the same thing since my relationship with this person was purely platonic. She demanded to know if it was a woman. I asked her why that mattered since she'd established that platonic friendships with the opposite sex were perfectly acceptable. She started yelling about how this was different, how I was doing this to hurt her, how I was being vindictive and immature. I listened to her rant while sipping coffee on the hotel balcony, watching the city wake up below. When she finally paused for breath, I told her I was simply applying the same standards she'd set for our relationship. I said I was learning to trust her judgment about appropriate friendship boundaries. The call ended with her hanging up on me. My ex and I spent Saturday touring museums and trying local restaurants. She was amused by the whole situation and admitted she'd always thought my wife was a bit controlling based on the stories I'd shared over the years. We took more photos, and I posted them strategically. Nothing inappropriate, but enough to show I was clearly with someone and having a great time. The calls and texts from my wife became increasingly frantic throughout the day. She cut her own trip short and was driving home early. She accused me of cheating, of betraying her trust, of being a vindictive person. She said she never wanted to see me like this and that she was disappointed in who I'd become. I reminded her via text that I was simply spending time with a platonic friend, exactly as she was doing. I pointed out that her reaction seemed hypocritical given her earlier statements about trust and friendship boundaries. Sunday morning, my ex and I had breakfast together before our flights home. She thanked me for a fun weekend and said she hoped things worked out with my wife, though she had her doubts. She'd seen enough of my marriage from the outside to recognize some troubling patterns. I posted one final photo before heading to the airport. A picture of 2 coffee cups on the breakfast table with the caption, "Great weekend with an amazing friend." Some friendships really are irreplaceable. My wife was waiting for me when I got home Sunday evening. She'd clearly been crying, and the house felt different somehow, charged with an energy I'd never experienced before. She wanted to talk immediately. She asked who I'd been with, and I told her the truth. Her face went through several expressions: shock, anger, hurt, and something else I couldn't quite identify. She accused me of orchestrating the entire situation to hurt her, of using my ex-girlfriend as a weapon against our marriage. I sat down across from her and calmly explained that I'd done exactly what she'd done. I'd spent a weekend with a platonic friend of the opposite sex. I reminded her that she'd made it very clear this was acceptable behavior in our relationship. I asked why her weekend with her male friend was appropriate, but mine wasn't. She tried to argue that it was different because she'd known her friend longer, because they'd never dated, because there was no romantic history. I pointed out that she was now admitting that romantic history mattered in these situations, which contradicted everything she'd said about trust and platonic friendships. She began crying and said I'd ruined everything. She claimed I'd made her look like a fool in front of her friend, embarrassed her on social media, and destroyed the trust in our relationship. She said she'd spent the entire weekend worried sick about what I was doing and with whom. I asked her if she was beginning to understand how I'd felt about her weekend plans. I asked if she could see why I might have been uncomfortable with the situation. I suggested that maybe, just maybe, I hadn't been unreasonable in expressing my concerns. She wiped her eyes and admitted that she hadn't considered how her weekend might make me feel. She said she'd been so focused on defending her friendship that she'd dismissed my feelings entirely. She acknowledged that if the roles were reversed, she probably would have been uncomfortable too. But then she accused me of handling the situation in the worst possible way. She said I should have communicated better instead of playing games. She claimed I'd acted out of spite and had intentionally hurt her when I could have simply talked through the issue. I reminded her that I had tried to communicate. I'd expressed my discomfort clearly, and she dismissed it. I'd been told I was insecure and unreasonable. I pointed out that the only way she'd been able to understand my perspective was by experiencing the same situation herself. The conversation went in circles for hours. She kept oscillating between acknowledging that she'd been wrong to dismiss my concerns and insisting that my response had been inappropriate and hurtful. She wanted me to apologize for the weekend, to admit I'd acted out of malice, to promise I'd never do anything like that again. I told her I'd consider an apology when she acknowledged that her dismissal of my feelings had created this entire situation. I said I was willing to discuss better communication in the future, but only if she could admit that my original concerns had been valid. Update 1. The next few days were tense. My wife oscillated between cold silence and attempts to restart the conversation. She'd clearly been talking to her friends about the situation because I started getting pointed looks from her social circle when we ran into them around town. On Wednesday evening, she came home with a different energy. She sat me down and said she'd been thinking about everything that had happened. She admitted that she'd been wrong to dismiss my feelings about her weekend trip. She acknowledged that she would have been upset if I'd planned a similar trip without discussing it with her first. But then she said something that caught me off guard. She told me she'd talked to her male friend about the situation, and he'd admitted that he'd always had feelings for her. He'd apparently thought the weekend trip might be an opportunity to explore those feelings, assuming she was having problems in her marriage based on some things she'd said. She swore nothing had happened between them, but she realized that I'd been right to be concerned. She said she'd been naive about his motivations and apologized for not taking my instincts seriously. She'd ended the friendship entirely and blocked him on all social media. I asked why she hadn't mentioned this earlier when we'd been fighting about the situation. She said she'd been embarrassed and hadn't wanted to admit I'd been right. She'd also been angry about my weekend and hadn't wanted to give me the satisfaction of being vindicated. She asked about my weekend with my ex, and I was completely honest. I told her nothing physical had happened, that we'd gotten separate rooms, and that the entire trip had been platonic as promised. But I also admitted that it had felt good to be with someone who listened to me without judgment, who made me feel heard and appreciated. She didn't like that answer. She accused me of having an emotional affair, of seeking validation from another woman instead of working on our marriage. She said that even if nothing physical happened, I'd still betrayed our relationship by finding emotional connection elsewhere. I pointed out the irony of her position. She'd just admitted that her male friend had romantic feelings for her and had hoped to act on them during their trip. Yet she was accusing me of betrayal for having honest conversations with my ex about feeling unheard in my marriage. The argument that followed was one of the worst we'd ever had. She accused me of twisting everything around, of making her the villain when I was the one who'd acted vindicatively. I told her I was tired of being made to feel crazy for having normal relationship concerns. Update 2. Things deteriorated quickly after that fight. My wife became obsessed with my relationship with my ex, checking my phone and social media constantly. She demanded I block my ex on everything and promised never to contact her again. When I hesitated, she threatened to leave. I realized I was facing a choice. I could give in to her demands, apologize for everything, and try to rebuild our marriage on the same foundation of dismissing my concerns and walking on eggshells around her feelings. Or I could stand my ground and insist on being treated as an equal partner in the relationship. I chose the latter. I told her I would not be blocking my ex, who had done nothing wrong and had actually helped me gain clarity about my marriage. I said I was willing to be transparent about any future contact, but I wouldn't be controlled or manipulated with ultimatums. She moved out the next day, going to stay with her sister. She sent me long texts about how I'd chosen another woman over our marriage, how I destroyed everything we'd built together, how she couldn't trust me anymore. I responded that I'd chosen self-respect over being controlled. I pointed out that she'd had no problem maintaining a friendship with a man who wanted to be with her, but couldn't tolerate me having any contact with a woman who had supported me through a difficult time in our marriage. The separation lasted 3 weeks. During that time, I had a lot of conversations with friends and family about what had happened. The responses were mixed. Some people thought I'd handled things poorly and should have been more mature about addressing my concerns. Others said they'd watched me shrink over the years of my marriage and were glad to see me standing up for myself. My ex texted me a few times during this period, checking to see how I was doing. The conversations were supportive but brief. I told her about the separation, and she said she was sorry things had escalated but hoped I'd find happiness whether that was in my marriage or elsewhere. Update 3. My wife returned home with conditions. She wanted couples counseling, complete transparency with phones and social media, and yes, she still wanted me to cut contact with my ex. She said these were non-negotiable terms for rebuilding trust in our marriage. I agreed to counseling, but refused the other conditions. I said I was willing to work on our communication and relationship patterns, but I wouldn't accept being controlled or monitored like a child. I told her that if she couldn't trust me after I'd been completely honest about everything, then we had bigger problems than my weekend trip. Counseling was enlightening. Our therapist helped us identify the patterns in our relationship that had led to this crisis. My wife had a tendency to dismiss concerns that made her uncomfortable, while I had a habit of avoiding conflict until I reached a breaking point and acted out. But the sessions also revealed something else. My wife's need to control my friendships and monitor my communications stemmed from her own guilt and insecurity about her behavior with her male friend. She'd been projecting her own capacity for crossing boundaries onto me. The therapist pointed out that trust isn't rebuilt through surveillance and control, but through consistent, honest behavior over time. She suggested that my wife's demands for access to my private communications actually indicated she wasn't ready to do the real work of rebuilding trust. After 2 months of counseling, we'd made some progress, but were still stuck on fundamental issues. My wife couldn't let go of her need to control my friendships, and I couldn't accept being in a relationship where my concerns were dismissed until I found dramatic ways to make my point. The final straw came when I discovered she'd been checking my location constantly through our shared phone plan and had even driven by places she thought I might be meeting my ex. When I confronted her about this surveillance, she said she was still rebuilding trust and needed reassurance. I realized then that she didn't want to rebuild our marriage. She wanted to rebuild her sense of control over me. The weekend trip had never really been about her friend or trust or boundaries. It had been about her right to do whatever she wanted while expecting me to have no opinions or feelings about it. I asked for a divorce the following week. Looking back, I don't regret the weekend trip that started this whole mess. It showed both of us who we really were when pushed to our limits. She was someone who needed to control and dismiss, and I was someone who wouldn't accept being controlled and dismissed. The irony is that she was right about one thing. It really wasn't the same thing. Her weekend trip was about maintaining a friendship while disregarding her husband's feelings. My weekend trip was about discovering I deserved better than being disregarded. Sometimes the most revealing thing about a relationship isn't how you handle the good times, but how you handle being treated exactly the way you treat others. She found out how not the same it was, all right. She found out what it felt like to be on the other side of dismissal and disregard. And I found out what it felt like to finally respect myself enough to walk away from someone who couldn't respect me at all.